Utilitarianism is a way of moral reasoning. It's a system of moral thought. It's a kind of pattern of thinking about morality, which is, in its central formula, very simple. That act or rule which is best, which is most just, which is optimal, which is what we should do, is that which produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. This is the utilitarian calculus, the idea that morality is about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. It's given most systematic expression by Jeremy Bentham, and then systematically refined into the middle of the 19th century, especially by John Stuart Mill. And so we'll consider the foundations and the career of utilitarianism, but before we do, consider its roots in the Enlightenment. In fact, utilitarianism in some ways can be said to go back to Epicureanism in the ancient world. And certainly even John Stuart Mill, one of the great utilitarians, would trace the ancestry of utilitarianism back to Epicurus, who was a hedonist who believed that the only calculus of good was the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. And we've seen how the ideas of Epicureanism are reborn in the 17th and especially the 18th century. The ideas that pleasure and the absence of pain are the true calculus of what's right and what's wrong. There's something that utilitarianism owes to the thought of Thomas Hobbes, who's a materialist and who sees people as motivated by their self-interest. It's there in the philosophy of John Locke, one of the most important conduits of the principle of happiness as the nature of moral calculus. And in his essay on human understanding, Locke argues for happiness as the essence of morality. It's given powerful expression in the Scottish Enlightenment. Even though we've seen the Scottish Enlightenment, especially its great founding figure, Francis Hutchison, is eager to salvage a view of virtue that's truly grounded in something other than self-interest, he nevertheless, in fact, Hutchison, gives very clear expression. He's the first to say that morality is about the greatest happiness for the greatest number. In fact, he uses that exact language in the very text we've looked at, his 1725 inquiry into the original of our ideas of beauty and virtue. And so Hutchison, who's trying to articulate an idea of benevolence, of the moral sense in which humans aren't just self-interested creatures, who's worried about the ways that Locke's philosophy endanger the very idea of virtue, who's deeply indebted to the Stoics and not the Epicureans, Hutchison nevertheless gives expression to this idea of the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But for Hutchison, it is still a deeply moral idea, happiness. Humans are motivated by true benevolence, not just by their own desire for pleasure. And Hutchison leaves room for the fundamental dignity of the individual, for something very much like what we would call their rights. But Bentham's version of utilitarianism will place no weight in rights or dignity or duty if those can't be dissolved into the calculus of pleasure and pain. Over the course of the 18th century, there's great debate over the meaning of happiness. Is it pleasure? Is it virtue? We've seen that one strand of this runs through the French materialists, most radically in the philosophy of La Mettrie and his idea that men are simply machines motivated by the search for pleasure. But these ideas percolate in both the French, the Italian Enlightenment, in England, in Scotland, David Hume, until they're given clear, systematic exposition in the thought of Jeremy Bentham. And Bentham is the great systemizer of utilitarianism.